The stars were quiet that morning. They always were, out in the Harath expanse. Commander Caleb Hurst stood at the wide observation window of the enduring wake and looked out at the nothing. It was a big nothing, the kind that stretched on for millions of miles in every direction, empty and cold and perfectly still. He had been looking at empty space for 12 years, and he still had not gotten used to how small it made him feel. Behind him, the ship hummed softly. The engines were at half power. There was no reason to push them. The survey mission did not require speed. It required patience, which was something Caleb had plenty of. Lieutenant Dana Voss came to stand beside him. She was holding 2 cups of coffee, and she handed one to him without saying anything. That was one of the things Caleb liked about Dana. She knew when words were not needed. They stood there for a while, just looking out at the dark. The Harath expanse was not on many maps. Most ships in the Galactic Concord had no reason to come here. It was far from the trade routes, far from the populated systems, far from anything that mattered politically. That was exactly why Earth had sent the enduring wake. There were minerals here, deep in certain asteroid clusters, that Earth's engineers wanted to study. It was quiet work, simple work. Or it was supposed to be. Caleb drank his coffee and thought about nothing in particular. The crew of 19 was spread across the ship, doing their jobs. Nate Corley was down in engineering, running his usual morning checks on the propulsion system. A few others were in the lab section, analyzing the samples they had collected the day before. The rest were eating, sleeping, or doing whatever it was people did on long survey missions when there was not much to do. Dana pointed at a faint cluster of rocks off to the left. "That one looks promising," she said. Caleb looked at it. "We will check it tomorrow," he said. There was no rush. The ship's sensors beeped once, then again. Caleb did not move right away. Sensors beeped all the time out here. Usually it was just rocks. He waited for the third beep, and when it came, he set down his coffee and walked to the command console. The readings were not rocks. 3 ships, large ones. They had appeared from nowhere, dropping out of what the sensor system was labeling as stealth mode. They were already close, too close. They had been sitting there, invisible, waiting. Caleb stared at the screen for a moment. He did not panic. He never panicked. But something cold settled in his chest as he read the identification codes attached to those 3 ships. He recognized the design. Everyone in Concord space knew it. The Vorath Syndicate. Dana was already at her station. "They are hailing us," she said. "Put it through," Caleb said. The voice that came through the speakers was flat and formal. It spoke in the common trade language of the Concord, which every crew member of the Enduring Wake understood well enough. The voice said that the human vessel had entered a zone of Vorath interest. It said that resistance would result in the immediate destruction of the ship. It said that the crew had 4 minutes to power down all systems and prepare for boarding. The voice did not say please. Caleb stood very still. He looked at the 3 ships on the screen. He ran numbers in his head. The Enduring Wake was a survey vessel. It had light defensive shielding and 2 small railguns, neither of which would scratch the armor on a Vorath heavy cruiser. Running was not an option. The Vorath ships were already positioned in a triangle around them. Fighting was not an option either. He thought about the rule that every Earth officer learned in training. The rule was not written in any official manual. It was passed down by word of mouth, from senior officers to junior ones. It went like this: if you are caught and you cannot fight and you cannot run, then you survive, you watch, and you wait. He keyed the ship-wide intercom. "All hands," he said, his voice calm and steady. "This is the commander. We are going to stand down. Follow all instructions from our visitors. Do not resist. Stay sharp." He could feel the tension move through the ship like a wave. 19 people holding their breath. He powered down the weapons systems himself. The Vorath boarding team came aboard 12 minutes later. There were 20 of them, all in heavy armor, all carrying weapons that looked like they could burn through a wall. They moved through the enduring wake with the kind of ease that came from doing this many times before. They separated the crew into groups and moved them to the central corridor. Caleb cooperated fully. He answered every question he was asked. He did not argue. He did not complain. He watched everything. He watched the way the Vorov soldiers moved. He watched where they positioned themselves. He watched which doors they locked and which ones they left open. He noted the time between their check-ins. He paid attention to the ones who seemed bored and the ones who seemed alert. He was counting, not out loud, not in any way anyone could see, but in his head, he was building a picture of everything around him, piece by piece. The crew of the enduring wake was transferred to a larger Vorov holding vessel 2 hours later. As Caleb walked up the boarding ramp with his hands in front of him, he took one last look back at his ship. It was still floating there, dark and quiet, surrounded by Vorov vessels. He did not look worried. He looked like a man who had a lot of time on his hands and intended to use every second of it. Inside the holding vessel, the crew was divided. Nate was separated from the main group almost immediately. Caleb watched them take him toward the engineering section of the ship. He filed that away. Dana caught his eye across the room. He gave her the smallest nod. She understood it. They were put into holding quarters. The rooms were small, but not cruel. The Vorath, whatever their intentions, were not torturing anyone. Not yet. They were keeping the crew healthy and calm. Caleb had enough experience with captivity negotiations to understand what that probably meant. They were bait. Live bait was worth more than dead bait. He sat down on the edge of a cot and stared at the ceiling. A few hours later, Dana came and sat beside him. They were alone for the moment, and she kept her voice low. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "I am counting," he said. She looked at him. "Counting what?" He looked at the ceiling, then at the walls, then at the door, then back at the ceiling. "Everything," he said. She was quiet after that, not because she did not understand, but because she did. Outside the small porthole window, the stars of the Harath expanse floated past, cold and indifferent. The Vorath ship moved through them at a steady speed, carrying 19 humans deeper into a trap that its commanders were very sure was already closed. They were wrong about that, but they did not know it yet. News traveled fast inside the Galactic Concorde, but not all news traveled the same way. Some news moved through official channels. It was packaged neatly, sent to the right desks, reviewed by committees, and discussed in long meetings before anyone decided what to do about it. That kind of news could take weeks. The news about the enduring wake did not travel that way. It traveled fast and quiet, the way important things do when important people decide that waiting is not an option. Within 18 hours of the ship going silent, Admiral Louise Farrow knew exactly what had happened. Within 24 hours, she was standing in front of the Concorde Joint Military Council, and she was not there to ask for permission. She was there to inform. The council chamber was large and cold, the way most official rooms were in the Concorde's central hub. Representatives from 40 different species sat in curved rows around the central floor. Some of them looked concerned. Some of them looked curious. A few of them, Farrow noticed, looked nervous in a very specific way, like people who already knew something bad was coming. She laid out the facts plainly. The Enduring Wake had been conducting a legal survey mission in the Harath expanse. It had disappeared. Vorath Syndicate vessels had been confirmed in that region by 2 independent sensor arrays. The crew of 19 humans was unaccounted for. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then the delegate from the Keth Alliance cleared his throat and suggested that perhaps a diplomatic message to the Vorath Syndicate would be the best first step. He said it in the gentle tone of someone who expected everyone to agree with him. The old Merethi delegate did not agree. His name was Uvo Shen, and he was 340 years old, which was middle-aged for a Merethi. He had been on the Concorde Council longer than most of the other delegates had been alive. He sat very still for a moment after the Keth delegate finished speaking, and then he turned to look at Admiral Pharaoh with his large, dark eyes. "How many ships do you need?" he asked. Pharaoh told him. Nobody argued after that. Uvo Shen had a reputation on the council for saying very little and being right every single time he said it. The other delegates had learned over many years that when the old Merethi spoke in that quiet, careful voice, the smart thing to do was listen. He did not explain his reasoning. He never did. But his reasoning was always correct. What none of the younger delegates knew, because it was not written in any document the Concord officially recognized, was that Uvo Shen had studied humanity for a very long time. His people had made a point of studying them, quietly, ever since humans had first appeared on Concord censor records 60 years ago. The Merethi had a long memory. They had seen many species come and go. They had watched empires rise and fall. They had a saying, passed down from elder to elder, that had never yet been wrong. The saying was, "A sleeping thing is most dangerous the moment before it wakes." Back on the Vorath holding vessel, the crew of the Enduring Wake had now been in captivity for 3 days. Nate Corley had not wasted a single hour. He had been put to work almost immediately. The Vorath engineers had looked at his file, seen that he was a propulsion and systems specialist, and decided that a human mechanic was worth more as a laborer than his dead weight. They gave him a list of maintenance tasks and sent him into the guts of their ship. Nate did not complain. He did not argue. He picked up his tools and went to work. He was very, very good at his job. This was a problem for the Vorath, though they did not yet understand why. Good mechanics are valuable, so they kept giving him more complex tasks. They moved him deeper into the ship's systems. They gave him access to panels and circuits that a prisoner absolutely should not have been allowed to touch. Nate noted every system he worked on. He noted what it did, where it connected, and how it could be interrupted. He did this with the same calm focus he brought to every technical problem. He did not rush. He just learned. Meanwhile, Dana Voss had been doing her own kind of work. She had spent the first day memorizing the layout of every corridor she had been walked through. On the second day, she began studying the patterns of the guards. There were 8 guards assigned to the human section of the ship. They worked in 2-hour rotations. There was a gap of about 4 minutes between each rotation change, when the outgoing guards were leaving and the incoming guards had not yet taken their full positions. 4 minutes was not much, but it was something. She also noticed that the guards talked to each other. Not in any language she understood, but she could read their body language. Some of them were bored. A few were alert. One of them, the tall one with the scratched visor, watched the humans too carefully. She made a note to keep him in mind. On the third evening, she started building the communication chain. She used a tapping code. It was an old system, originally developed for miners trapped underground on Earth, who needed to communicate without being heard. Every crew member of the Enduring Wake had learned it during training, the same way every Earth crew learned basic survival protocols. The Vorath did not know it existed. She started small. A few taps to the crew member in the next room, a confirmation tap back, then another link, and another, until she had a quiet, invisible chain running through all the occupied cells in the human section. When Caleb received her first full message through the chain, he read it twice, with his eyes closed, translating the taps. Then he lay back on his cot and allowed himself the smallest of smiles. Dana had mapped 4 patrol routes, identified the shift gap, located the nearest junction to the engineering section, and confirmed that Nate was alive, working, and in place. She had done all of this in 72 hours. Caleb tapped back a single short message. It meant, "Good work. Keep going." On the Vorath command deck, Veth Saran was reviewing the situation with quiet satisfaction. He was a tall creature, lean and sharp-featured, with the kind of confidence that came from being very intelligent and almost never being wrong. He had planned this operation for months. He had picked the Enduring Wake specifically because it was small and lightly defended and far from backup. He had chosen the Harath Expanse because it was outside normal Concord patrol routes. He had done everything correctly. His communications officer brought him the first response from Earth. It was not what he had expected. It was not outrage. It was not a threat. It was not a demand for the immediate release of the crew. It was a single formal acknowledgement. It said that Earth had received his message and was considering a response. It was signed by someone in a low-level diplomatic office. One of Veth Saran's advisors, a cautious being named Das Verith, watched his commander read the message and said nothing for a moment. Then he asked, quietly, whether perhaps the humans were planning something rather than panicking. Veth Saran dismissed the idea. Humans had been in the Concord for 60 years and had never gone to war with anyone. They were cooperative by nature, diplomatic by habit, and far too attached to their procedures and committees to move quickly. Das Verith did not argue, but he looked at the sensor readings for the Harath Expanse and felt, for no reason he could specifically name, deeply uneasy. Far out, at the edge of the expanse, where the sensor coverage was thin and the light from distant stars barely reached, 11 human warships sat in perfect silence. They had no running lights. They were broadcasting nothing. They were simply there, waiting, as patient as stone. Admiral Pharaoh stood on the bridge of the lead vessel and watched the slow crawl of the Vorath holding ship on her deep-range display. She had been watching it for 9 days. He had learned, a long time ago, that the most important part of any operation was the waiting. Anyone could act. The hard part was acting at exactly the right moment, not a second too early and not a second too late. She would know when the moment came. She was very good at recognizing it. On the 14th day, Veth Saran made his broadcast. It went out across the full range of Concord communication channels. It was well produced. The Vorath had good equipment and knew how to use it. The broadcast showed the human crew of the Enduring Wake standing in their holding quarters, alive and unharmed, which was meant to show Vorath restraint. Then Veth Saran appeared on screen and delivered his demands in a clear, calm voice. He wanted Earth to formally recognize Vorath territorial claims over 2 star systems that were currently administered by the Concord. He wanted a written statement from Earth's leadership acknowledging that the Vorath Syndicate had the right to expand its borders. He gave a deadline of 40 standard days. The broadcast was seen by hundreds of species across Concord space. Most of them went very quiet. Not because they were frightened of the Vorath, though the Vorath were certainly dangerous. They went quiet because of something else. Something in the back of their collective memory stirred. Old stories surfaced. Warnings that had been passed from elder to younger for generations, often without any real explanation, only the firm instruction to remember them. On a small research station near the center of Concord space, a young historian named U Veleth watched the broadcast from her desk and felt the hair on the back of her neck stand up. She was a Korathi, a species that looked something like a tall, pale insect with 4 arms and large compound eyes. She was 22 years old and had spent the last 4 years writing her doctoral thesis on interspecies conflict patterns. She pulled up her archive and started searching. It took her 3 hours. The records were old, some of them fragmentary, but they were there if you knew where to look. She found 4 separate instances in recorded galactic history of a spacefaring species deliberately capturing or threatening a human vessel or a human crew. In the first case, the species responsible had issued a formal apology within 2 weeks and returned the captured crew. Their home fleet had been surrounded by human ships without warning, and the encounter had apparently convinced them that further aggression was not in their interest. In the second case, the species had not apologized. They had escalated. The conflict that followed had lasted 11 months. At the end of it, that species no longer controlled their own home system. They were still alive, still functioning as a civilization, but they were doing so under terms dictated by other parties. The third and fourth cases were shorter and more severe. Uvelek stared at her screen for a long time. Then she sent a compressed file of her findings to every Concord Council delegate, anonymously, through a public research distribution channel. She labeled it simply, Historical Context for Current Events. She did not know if anyone would read it, but she had to send it. The reason the rule existed was not complicated, though it had taken the galaxy a long time to understand it. Humans were not the strongest species in the Concord. They were not the oldest or the most technically advanced. In a straight fight between a human fleet and the fleet of one of the great elder powers, the humans would probably lose. But a straight fight was almost never what happened. What happened instead was this. When humans were pushed into a corner, they did not panic. They fought. They observed. They adapted. They found angles of attack that no one had considered. They made use of every resource available to them, no matter how small or unlikely, and then, when the moment was right, they moved all at once, with everything they had, without hesitation. Other species, when cornered, often gave up or fell apart. Humans had a different response. It was buried deep in them, woven into them by millions of years of surviving on a planet that had tried to kill them in every way imaginable. When the pressure became extreme, something in them became very still and very focused, and they began to find ways out of situations that should have had no way out. The oldest species in the galaxy had a name for this. It did not translate perfectly into any other language, but the closest version in the common trade tongue was something like, the animal that learns the trap. Nate Corley, on day 14, learned the navigation system. He had not been assigned to it. A routine maintenance task in a nearby section had given him access to a connecting conduit, and through that conduit he had found a panel that a more cautious prisoner absolutely would have left alone. Nate was not reckless. He was precise. He studied the panel for a long time before he touched anything. The Vorath navigation system was well designed. He could appreciate that, even now. But every system had weak points, and this one was no different. There was a calibration sequence that ran automatically every 8 hours. If that sequence received slightly incorrect data at one specific point, the ship would drift. Not dramatically, just a few degrees, enough over time to change the vessel's course in a way that would look like a minor, self-correcting error. He introduced the error. He did it carefully, in a way that left no obvious trace. Then he went back to his assigned work and did not look at that panel again. 2 decks up, Caleb was receiving Dana's latest message through the tap chain. She had found the service corridor. She had confirmed the shift gap. She had identified a communications junction on Deck 4 that was accessible from a maintenance hatch near the human section. He thought about all of it for a long time. He was not ready to move yet. Moving too early would waste everything they had built. The timing had to be right. He needed one more piece. He needed to know where Pharaoh was. He could not contact her directly. He had no access to external communications. But he had something else. He had been watching the Vorath crew for 2 weeks, and he had noticed something. When Vorath officers checked their sensor displays in the morning, several of them had recently started doing something new. They looked at the long-range section of the display first, and they stayed on it a little longer than they used to. That was interesting. It meant something was out there, that they were keeping an eye on, something they had not expected, something that had arrived recently and was staying put. Caleb allowed himself to feel something very close to relief, though he kept his face perfectly neutral. Pharaoh was there. She had to be, and she was waiting. On the Vorath command deck, the navigation officer reported a minor calibration drift. He said it appeared to be a sensor alignment issue and recommended a standard correction. Veth Saran approved the correction without looking up from the broadcast response reports he was reading. The correction ran through the system. The ship adjusted its course. Nate, 3 decks below, felt the slight change in the ship's movement through the floor. He knew exactly what it meant. He had designed the drift specifically to push the ship toward a region of space where sensor coverage was thin. The correction, running through the modified system, had not pointed the ship back to its original course. It had pointed the ship somewhere else entirely. That night, lying on his cot in the engineering crew quarters, Nate stared at the ceiling and did quiet math in his head. Numbers, distances, times. He was not a dramatic person. He did not feel heroic. He just felt like someone who had a job to do and was doing it carefully. He closed his eyes and went to sleep. Outside, the Vorath ship moved steadily through the dark, carrying 19 humans and a crew of 200 Vorath soldiers, all of them completely unaware that the ship was no longer going where they thought it was going. The galaxy's oldest rule was about to be remembered, the hard way. On the morning of day 19, Dana tapped 3 short beats against the wall. That was the signal. They had been waiting for it. Caleb was already standing when it came. He had barely slept. He had spent the night going over the plan one more time in his head, checking it, looking for problems, finding none that he had not already accounted for. He pulled on his jacket, took a slow breath, and walked to the door of his cell. He knocked politely. The guard who opened it was the bored one, not the careful one with the scratched visor. That was exactly according to plan. Dana had identified the shift schedule down to the minute. Caleb told the guard that he had a medical concern. He was calm, cooperative, and completely unthreatening. The guard sighed and told him to come out. Caleb came out. He asked the guard to take him to the medical section, which was 1 level up and on the opposite side of the ship from everything important. The guard started walking. Caleb followed, counting steps, noting the position of every sensor node on the ceiling. 2 decks below, something in the Vorath ship's life support system began to behave strangely. It was not dangerous. Nate had been very precise about that. He had introduced a pressure variance into the ventilation circuits that served the Vorath crew quarters. The effect was a drop in atmospheric pressure, just significant enough to cause mild dizziness and a feeling of nausea. Not harmful, just deeply uncomfortable. The Vorath guards assigned to the human section began to feel it almost immediately. 2 of them called into their communicators. One of them sat down. The one with the scratched visor shook his head and gripped the wall for a moment. For 60 seconds, their attention was elsewhere. Dana moved. She had 6 crew members with her, picked carefully for what each of them could do. They came out of their cells fast and quiet, moving in the precise pattern Dana had described to them through the tap chain over the previous 4 days. The corridor was clear. The maintenance hatch was exactly where she had said it would be. They were through it and into the service corridor before the guards outside had recovered. The service corridor connected to the lower deck. The lower deck connected to the engineering section. And the engineering section was where Nate was waiting. He had prepared 3 things. The first was a full map of the Vorath ship's communication systems, hand-drawn on a piece of material he had torn from the inside of a maintenance panel cover. The second was a modified access tool that could interface with Vorath communication hardware, which he had built over 17 days using components that were small enough to hide in a closed fist. The third was a very specific package of data. The package contained the navigational signatures of every Vorath ship in the region, their current positions, their heading data, and a breakdown of their communication encryption. Nate had assembled it piece by piece during his weeks of system access, storing each fragment in his own memory because there was nowhere else to store it. He had written it all out the previous night. She handed him the access tool and pointed at the communication junction on the wall. He got to work. Meanwhile, Caleb had reached the command deck. He had managed it the same way he managed most things, by being so calm and ordinary that nobody thought to stop him until it was too late. He had redirected his guard toward the medical section, doubled back through a service passage Dana had mapped, and arrived at the command deck door at the exact moment that 2 Vorath officers were coming out of it with their hands full of equipment. He walked in behind them. The bridge of a Vorath heavy cruiser was large and busy. There were 12 officers at their stations. None of them initially paid attention to the single human who walked quietly to the communications array at the far end of the room. Caleb sat down at the array, placed his hand on the panel, and looked at the controls. He had watched Vorath communications officers work for 19 days through a narrow observation window in his cell block. He understood the layout. He sent the signal. It went out in a compressed burst, encrypted in an Earth military code that no Vorath system would recognize as significant. It took 11 seconds. It contained everything Nate had gathered: positions, headings, encryption data, course projections. Then someone on the bridge shouted. Caleb stood up slowly and turned around. The room had gone very still. 8 weapons were pointed at him. Veth Saran stood at the center of the bridge, his expression moving through surprise and into something colder. Caleb put his hands out to his sides to show they were empty. "You are too late," Caleb said. His voice was steady. "Whatever you are planning to do right now, you are already too late." Far out at the edge of the Harath expanse, Admiral Farrow received the signal. She read it once. She looked up at her navigation officer. "Move," she said. 11 human warships came out of the dark all at once. They did not fire any warning shots. They simply appeared, positioned at precise intervals around the Vorath vessels in the region, each one sitting exactly where it needed to be to cover every possible angle of escape. The Vorath captains on those vessels looked at their sensor displays and saw something they had not expected at all. They saw that every route out was already closed. Pharaoh's communications officer hailed each Vorath vessel in sequence. The message was polite and brief. It explained that the vessels were surrounded. It offered the option of standing down and releasing the human crew. It noted that the alternative was being disabled, not destroyed, because Pharaoh was not interested in casualties on either side if they could be avoided. 7 Vorath captains stood down within 4 minutes. 2 did not. The 2 that did not found their propulsion systems shut off within 90 seconds by electronic warfare teams that had been prepped for exactly this response. The ships did not blow up, they did not burn, they simply stopped moving, drifting quietly in space, all their engines dark. Back on the holding vessel, Veth Saran stared at the tactical display on the bridge and watched his operation come apart in real time. He had planned for many things. He had not planned for this. He turned to Caleb, who was still standing calmly in the middle of the bridge with his hands at his sides. "How long have you been planning this?" Veth Saran asked. "Since the first hour," Caleb said. Veth Saran was quiet for a moment, then he reached for Caleb's arm. Caleb did not move away. He just looked at him. "If you use me as a hostage," Caleb said quietly, "you need to be willing to actually harm me. And if you harm me, what is coming for you will be worse than what is already here. I want you to think about that very carefully before you decide." There was something in his voice that stopped Veth Saran. It was something more like a simple fact, stated by someone who had no reason to exaggerate. Veth Saran let go of his arm. Dana and her team secured the lower decks over the next 3 hours. The Vorath crew did not put up serious resistance. They were outnumbered. Their ship was drifting toward a fleet that had just dismantled their allies, and their commander had gone very quiet on the bridge. By the time the last section was secured, every member of the Enduring Wake's crew was accounted for. 3 had minor injuries. All 19 were standing. All 19 were functional. Caleb walked through each section himself to confirm it. He shook hands with each crew member he passed. He did not say much. He did not need to. When he finally came back to the bridge, Veth Saran was sitting in a chair, with 2 human crew members standing near him. He looked smaller than he had before. He looked at Caleb for a long moment. "You were waiting for the fleet," he said. "Yes," Caleb said. "You were always waiting for the fleet." "Yes," Caleb said again. Veth Saran was quiet. He had no more questions. Or perhaps he had too many, and none of them felt useful anymore. They gave the enduring wake back 2 days after the holding vessel was secured. A small team of Pharaoh's engineers went over it first, stem to stern, checking every system and every panel. The Vorath had not damaged anything. They had not even moved things around much. The ship was exactly as the crew had left it, just sitting quietly in space, waiting. Caleb walked aboard alone before anyone else. He moved through the corridors slowly, running his hand along the walls. He checked the observation window. He checked the command console. He went down to engineering and looked at every panel, not because anything was wrong, but because he needed to see it for himself. He needed to know it was still his ship. Nate appeared in the engineering doorway a few minutes later. "Everything okay?" Nate asked. "Run a full diagnostic," Caleb said. "I already checked the main systems. Everything reads clean." "Run a full diagnostic," Caleb said again. Nate understood. He sat down and started running it. The rest of the crew came aboard over the next hour. There was no ceremony, no speeches. People just found their stations and started doing their jobs, because that was what they knew how to do, and because it felt better to be busy than to stand around thinking about the past 19 days. Dana was the last one aboard. She stood at the top of the boarding ramp for a moment and looked back at Pharaoh's fleet, still positioned in a loose formation around the area. Then she stepped inside and pulled the hatch shut behind her. She found Caleb at the observation window again. He had a cup of coffee. She sat down across from him. "Are you going to write the report?" she asked. "Already started," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "Are you all right?" He thought about it. "Yes," he said. "Are you?" She thought about it too. "Ask me in a week," she said. He nodded. That was a fair answer. In the weeks that followed, the Vorath Syndicate came apart. It did not explode. It did not collapse in a single dramatic moment. It just slowly, quietly fell to pieces, the way things do when the pressure that held them together suddenly disappears. The three species that made up the Syndicate had always had differences. Vet Saran's operation had papered over those differences by giving them a common goal. Now that the goal had failed, publicly and completely, there was nothing left to paper over. Each species began publicly blaming the others for the plan. The diplomatic communications between them, which had once been warm and coordinated, became cold and then stopped almost entirely. 2 of the 3 species reached out to the Concord within 30 days. They wanted to discuss new membership terms. They wanted it handled quietly. The Concord, at Pharaoh's recommendation, agreed to hear them out. The 3rd species said nothing at all. They withdrew their ambassador from the Concord hub and went very still. The Vorath Syndicate, as a political entity, ceased to exist 41 days after the liberation of the Enduring Wake's crew. Nobody held a ceremony for it. Admiral Pharaoh addressed the Concord Joint Military Council 3 weeks after the incident. She came alone, without aides or assistants. She wore her dress uniform, which she almost never did, because she wanted the council to understand that what she was about to say was formal and serious. She presented a single document. It was a proposed amendment to Concord interstellar law. The amendment stated that the unlawful detention of any Concord member crew or vessel was to be considered a capital offense against the Concord itself. It further specified that Earth's interstellar response fleet was formally authorized to act as enforcement authority in any such case, with or without prior Concord Council approval, as long as the detaining party had been given a reasonable opportunity to release the crew and had declined. She did not give a long speech. She presented the document, explained its main points, and waited. The chamber was quiet for a moment. Then Uvo Shen, the old Merethi delegate, raised his hand. He did not say anything. He just raised his hand. One by one, every other delegate raised theirs. The vote was unanimous. Nobody argued, and nobody abstained. Pharaoh thanked the council, gathered her document, and walked out. In the corridor outside the chamber, she allowed herself one long breath. Then she straightened her uniform and went back to work. Nate received a job offer from the Concord Central Engineering Authority 2 weeks, after returning to Earth. It was a significant position. Good pay, important work, a chance to work on systems that served hundreds of species across the galaxy. He looked at the offer for a long time. He set it on his desk. Then, he went to find Dana. She was in the cafeteria at the Earth Exploratory Corps headquarters, drinking coffee and reading a survey report. He sat down across from her. "I got an offer," he said. "I know," she said. "I heard. Are you going to take it?" He looked at his coffee. "I have not decided." She nodded. "I got one too. Commander. My own ship." He looked up. "Are you going to take it?" "Yes," she said immediately. There was no hesitation at all. He smiled a little. "Deep space?" "Deep space," she said. They drank their coffee in silence for a while. Outside the window, the sky was the kind of clear blue that made the rest of the galaxy feel very far away. "I think I'm going to say no to the engineering job," Nate said. She looked at him. "I think I want to go back out," he said. "On a ship, somewhere far." "There is an opening on my crew," she said. He thought about it. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." Caleb submitted his official mission log to the Earth Exploratory Corps on a quiet Tuesday morning. The log was precise and factual. It recorded the date and location of the interception, the names and conditions of all 19 crew members, the duration of captivity, the actions taken, and the outcome. It used the plain language required of official documents, and did not editorialize. It was the kind of report that would be filed away and read by desk officers and archived in a database somewhere, as most mission logs eventually were. At the very bottom, below the official entry, there was a short handwritten note. It was not part of the official log. It was just something he had added because he felt like it needed to be there. It said, "They thought having us meant they had us. They forgot that having someone and holding someone are two very different things. We never stopped looking for the way out. We never do." He signed it, sealed the file, and sent it. Then he poured himself a cup of coffee, walked to his window, and looked out at the city below. Somewhere up above all of that, past the blue of the atmosphere and the silence of near orbit, the stars were still there. The same ones he had been looking at for 12 years. The same ones that had looked back at him through the observation window of a Vorath holding vessel for 19 very long days. They had not changed. He had not changed either, he thought. He was just the same person he had always been. A man who counted things. A man who waited for the right moment. A man who had learned a long time ago that the only way out of a corner was straight through it. He drank his coffee. He started thinking about the next mission. Out in the Concord, in the quiet spaces between the stars, the old rules settled back into the memory of every species that had ever whispered it. It did not need to be announced or officially recorded. It did not need to be broadcast or explained. It was simply true, and everyone knew it now a little more firmly than they had before. Do not ensnare the humans. They will find the way out.